What's going on, everybody? It's Joel here, and today we're doing the review of the Hyperice Hypervolt and the Hypervolt Plus percussive massagers. So initially I wanted to do a introductory video on percussive massagers just in general to go over some of the values on what differentiates all the different types, because when I first started my journey down the rabbit hole with percussive massagers, I didn't really know, didn't really care. But after I did the review of the 8th Way massager, I figured I should probably verse myself a little bit better on the differences between all the percussive massagers. So a few of the things that we're gonna go over are things like stroke length, which is basically how far the tip goes back and forth. It's very self-explanatory in that sense. And then there's stall force, which is basically how much force it takes for you to put down before that motor stops working. And then certain massagers use hertz as a measure of speed, which the Hypervolts do. And then there's also battery size, which is pretty self-explanatory once again. Basically just uses milliamperes as your measure of battery life. But that's also relative to how much force you're putting down per device. So if you're pressing harder, it's gonna work that battery a lot more, which is going to drain your battery a little bit faster. So without further ado, let's talk about the Hypervolt and the Hypervolt Plus. The differences between these are that the Hypervolt normal has a 60-watt motor, whereas the Hypervolt Plus has a 90-watt motor. The battery size is the same exact 2400 milliampere battery. So the Hypervolt Plus is going to have worse battery life than the Hypervolt just naturally because it takes more power. The stroke length on the Hypervolt is 10 millimeters, whereas the stroke length on the Hypervolt Plus is 13 millimeters. I believe they work on the same frequencies, which the lowest speed is going to be 30 hertz, and then it's going to go up to 40 hertz, and then the max speed is going to be 53 hertz. So inside the box, you're going to find pretty much the same exact things. I brought the Hypervolt Plus box here with me. Inside the box, you'll find 5 or 4 different tips. The flat tip is actually on the device, it comes on it by default. And then you have the pointed tip, the little U-shaped tip, the ball tip, and then the cushion tip, which is probably my second favorite one. And then you get a little manual, and then you get the charger, which is in there. Which is actually a pretty nice charger, but I think it's a little much compared to some of like the other cheaper massagers that I've tried, which have a much more compact power supply, which I personally like just because it just takes up less space. But I do appreciate the presentation of that. The one criminal thing with the Hypervolt and the Hypervolt Plus is that they both don't come with a case, and Hyperice charges $50 for the carrying case, which is absolutely ridiculous considering how much these things cost. This is $350 and this is $450. Even the cheaper $100 percussive massagers come with cases, so I think it's absolutely inexcusable that these ones do not come with cases. So when it comes to use, both the Hypervolt and the Hypervolt Plus are pretty much the same exact thing. You turn it on with a switch on the bottom, which also has where the power outlet goes into. And then you've got this LED ring that lights up, and that is your first battery indicator. On the back, there's also more lights indicating the battery charge. I kept the sticker on, but you're supposed to take this off. And then you have your power button, which once you turn on, there's gonna be 3 little white blinking lights, and that's gonna be your pressure indicator. I really like that Hyperice includes a pressure indicator, and then you also have 3 speeds. This is on the first speed, second speed, third speed, and then off. Another thing that I also like about the Hypervolt, which is a very minor thing, is that there's like a little startup animation. So it kind of winds up and accelerates, and then there's a little cooling down deceleration motion, which I think is a cool little touch, but it is unnecessary. The Hypervolt is for sure the quietest percussive massager that I've tried at all 3 settings. I think it's reasonable to have a conversation over these devices. The Hypervolt Plus is for sure a little bit louder, but You know, obviously that's going to be because of the 90-watt motor, but even still at its loudest setting, I still think it is fairly reasonable to have a conversation over these devices. So when comparing the two devices, you obviously get a stronger amplitude and a stronger motor with the Hypervolt Plus. Personally, I think the Hypervolt Plus is the better device. I would spend that extra $100 over the Hypervolt because of the stronger motor and the longer stroke length. But it's going to really come down to who you are as an athlete. I think the normal Hypervolt is going to suit most people just fine. But if you're an advanced to an elite athlete, then I would say the Hypervolt Plus is going to be the option for you. I personally use this one more than my normal Hypervolt, which is more, in my opinion, of a like mellow massage, whereas I feel like the Hypervolt Plus works a little bit better for me personally. I think the results that I get from both of them is pretty much the same exact thing. I do feel like they help me warm up well, and I do feel like they help me cool down and flush the muscles out when I use them. But personally, I feel like the Hypervolt Plus is just a little bit more effective because it's just stronger. If you're looking for something that's just quiet to use, I think Hyperice makes the best devices as far as percussive massages that are a little bit more on the quiet side. Okay, so Hyperice doesn't actually disclose the stall force for their Hypervolt or the Hypervolt Plus, but using all the devices that I've used, I would estimate that the normal Hypervolt is somewhere around 40 pounds of stall force, whereas the Hypervolt Plus is probably somewhere closer to 60. I'm going to turn it on. Like I said before, what I really like about Hyperice is that they include some kind of pressure sensor. So you have to wait for the white lights to turn on. Now I'm just going to turn this all the way to 3. And I'm going to put down some force here. So there it is. There, it stopped right there. For some reason, it's not turning back on. But anyways, let's move on over to the Hypervolt Plus. Turned it on. So even with 2 hands, I can't stop the Plus. With 1 hand, there's no way I'd be able to stop this. With the normal Hypervolt, one-handed, let's turn that on max. One-handed, I feel like I could stop it if I was at the right angle. With 2 hands, I can for sure stop this. Like I said, I don't think many people are going to be pressing down that hard. So most people should be okay with the normal Hypervolt. But if you are planning on putting some pressure down, then definitely get the Plus. So the way that I personally use them is I mainly just use them to warm up. So when I'm stretching, I'll use them to help flush blood into those areas that I'm stretching out. And then when I'm cooling down after a workout, I'll use them to flush blood into areas for a little bit extra hydration for the muscles. And then I do keep one bedside so that when I go to sleep, I just get in that quick little mobility session before I knock out. For all of those uses, I found that both of them are just fine, but I do find myself gravitating a little bit more towards the Hypervolt Plus. For results, I honestly don't think that there's a huge difference between both the devices. I like the way that the Hypervolt Plus feels when I use it, but when it comes to actual like recovery and warm up, I think I can warm up just fine with both of them. I recover just fine with both of them as well. I think having either of them is better than not using any at all. So like I said before, the Hypervolt retails for $350. The Hypervolt Plus retails for $450. They're not the cheapest percussive massagers on the market. And in my opinion, I still think that there are better values out there. But if you're looking at the Hypervolt or the Hypervolt Plus, they're both awesome devices. Personally, like I said, I would spend the extra $100 on the Hypervolt Plus because I find myself using that one more. But if you don't care to go too hard on yourself, then I'd say the normal Hypervolt is going to be fine for you. Either way, I think that they're both excellent devices. I do think it's a freaking shame that they don't come with a case, and I think that's ridiculous. I think they should just include that for the price tag that you're paying for either of these. But like I said, the devices are both good. So if you're looking at either one of these, I'd say it's a win-win situation. If you guys have any questions about either the Hypervolt or the Hypervolt Plus, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And as always guys, please hit that like button, subscribe, and thanks for watching.